I think the interesting thing is already the tourism industry is growing much faster than the fishing industry, so we will have a more valuable tourism industry coming out.
So can you tell us what's happening in the Ross Sea currently?
So we've had some very exciting developments. I was just down in Hobart at the Convention for the Living Aquatic Resource Management of Antarctic waters, and this is in fact 10% of the world ocean. And there was a big announcement. We actually protected large parts of the Ross Sea. Now, Ross Sea is south of New Zealand, close to the peninsula. This area is the size, twice the size of Texas, or 3.5 times the size of my country, Sweden. So it's a very sizable area, and it's now been put in protection measures to protect penguins, to protect many of the things that live down there. It's quite exciting because it is one of the first times we've created a very large area in what is beyond national jurisdiction. So this is not an area that is actually currently managed as an exclusive economic zone, which much of the ocean is close to land. So we have a fantastic opportunity here, I think, to really protect much of the wildlife that is still there. And this is perhaps the last ocean that is still very much intact and similar to what it would have been, let's say, 1,000 years ago. So for us, this is a great victory. This is the result of a lot of hard work. I would particularly want to say outgoing Secretary Kerry of US State Department, I think, has been one of the main drivers of this. But President Vladimir Putin was involved in the decision as well on the Russian side. And in fact, 24 countries in the EU got together and decided to do this. So I think for conservation, this is a big victory.
So what is high sea protection and who are the benefiters of this?
So the high seas is basically, as I mentioned, areas beyond national jurisdiction. So most of the ocean would be 200 miles offshore. That's to say it's quite far out there, but in fact it's 45% of the planet. So almost half of the planet is the high seas. What we're seeing in these areas is generally very deep water. The average depth of the ocean is 4,000 meters. So there's a lot of water, and there's on the bottom of it sort of very dark, cold places. Now, what's interesting with the high seas is there's lots of underwater mountains as well. There's maybe more than 100,000 or so underwater mountains. That would be at least 500 meters high. Beyond that also, of course, you have the migrating fish that many of us like to eat, for example, tuna. But you also have a number of other interesting resources. So there's various new industries coming up, including a mining industry which is interested in high seas areas.
So what industries will be affected by the high sea protection?
So I think one of the ones which will be affected, of course, is the fishing industry. Traditionally, fishing has been one of the main activities in the high seas. What we see now in the Ross Sea is we have a compromise where there's some research fishing that will continue. And of course, there are parts of the Ross Sea that's not in this protection zone that is also going to be continue seeing fishing. And in fact, in the Antarctic, we have two main types of fisheries. One is for something called the Patagonia toothfish, or Chilean sea bass if you go to restaurants. This is a very slow-growing fish. It gets sexually mature maybe at 35, 40 years or so. So, you know, it would have been your grandparents or so that we're eating in many cases. The problem with this fish is we really can't fish it in a sustainable way. So what we're doing right now is we're hauling out some of the last ones for essentially a luxury fishery. The other thing is the krill fishery, and by and large, the krill fishery is barely making any money. And what we're doing with it is largely going into fish meal, which is to say it's the same as if we were fishing sardines off Peru. The price for fish meal has always been low. It will always be low because as soon as it gets more valuable, it's not going to be made into fish meal, it's going to be made to a value-added product. Our problem is we can't really eat krill without getting sick. So humans don't really like eating krill. We might have it as dietary supplements, and so it's used a bit like that. But by and large, I would say right now there isn't really a very useful high value for krill. So we have a subsidized krill fishery. We have a luxury fishery for this toothfish, which maybe 1 promille of the world population can eat. And that's how we manage most of the waters of the Antarctic. So in some ways, this is a very strange setup, and that's why we as conservation groups have felt now's the time to actually protect more of the Antarctic. There's several other proposals that are on the table. One for the Weddell Sea, which is in the South Atlantic. There's also the East Antarctica area, and there's the peninsula of the Antarctic continent, which also has a number of areas. So over the coming years, we'll see a lot more protection in these areas. That, I think, will impact industries that are currently available. I think the interesting thing is already the tourism industry is growing much faster than the fishing industry, so we will have a more valuable tourism industry coming out. Of course, this is great news to have these protection zones for the tourism industry because it ensures that we'll have more presence of penguins and whales and dolphins and all kinds of other exciting things that we see in the Antarctic waters.
So are there any climate changes that you are seeing that are affecting the polar region which are causing troubles for the industries?
Well, in fact, we've seen very dramatic shifts in the climate over the last few years. We recently did a report where we actually documented a lot what was happening, particularly in the polar regions. Fishing is moving gradually north. Just at a conference in Norway last week where we had a discussion about the climate impacts, it's quite striking that both in terms of harvesting fish, but also looking at aquaculture and new types of developments, it does give new opportunities. And perhaps more dramatic is the fact that areas that have been permanently ice covered are now melting, both on land, but also in terms of sea ice. And this is an accelerating phenomenon. So when you start losing sea ice, the reflection gets less and less, which means you'll have an even quicker warming of these areas.
Well, thank you so much for joining us in the studio and speaking on this wonderful topic.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And thank you at home for watching. Don't forget to click back for more interviews like this. Goodbye for now.